So this week, I think almost all of you were here last week. You know that we sort of tried to tease out this idea of separation of church and state, which I would argue has been it's been very powerful. It's been a very powerful concept in the United States in two ways. One, it has emboldened certain sects, especially of Christianity, but of a lot of religions. It has emboldened them to have this sense of we can do whatever we want because the government can't tell us not to. And we should be allowed to do whatever we want or not do some things the government asks us to because of the separation. The other one that I think is equally powerful and equally dangerous is I think it also has been a excuse for a whole separate sect of people of faith to say, well, we shouldn't talk about faith in public. We shouldn't really mention that we're people of faith when it comes to politics. We really just shouldn't get involved. And I think that comes from a good place. I think that comes from a loving place of not wanting to trample on the neighbor, wanting to be as inclusive as possible and loving as possible. But I think that it loses out. So I think the important thing from us last week is to piece out this idea that it's not what we think it is. It's not as powerful as we think it is. And it's certainly not enshrined the way I think many of us think it is. But rather that we do have this ability, and I would argue a call to speak and act in the public square as people of faith. So that was an important stepping stone. That was an important sort of starting place for us as we have these conversations to really talk about ways that we can, things we can focus on, and really what do we do with it once we realize that we have this call and ability to enact our faith publicly. So this week, I wanted to discuss a little bit sort of these four big concepts that actually we just heard yesterday in Paul's letter, and then he uses them elsewhere as well. And we'll see that quote in a minute. But to talk a little bit about sort of these grand concepts of lawful, beneficial, good, and right. Because on the surface, these all seem like things that we should be supporting. We should be supporting things that are lawful and supporting things that are beneficial and supporting things that are good and supporting things that are right. But I think we don't always take time to think about what that means for us, and how it's not always the case, right? Paul will say on this next slide, in First Corinthians, Paul will say, all things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Do not seek your own advantage, but that of others. And I think for us, when we talk about engaging in the world and what sort of the call is, I think often what we are called to is to challenge things that are not beneficial, things that don't build up, things that seek self gain over the greater good. For those of you that were part of any of our prayer services on election day, you heard me talk a lot about the common good. Certainly, as Lutherans, one of our concepts of government is that um, it is one of the ways that God works in the world, right? It is one of the two kingdoms. It is one of the ways the law, capital L, is enacted. It is in many ways God ordained in that the world needs order that the world can understand, but that it should always be for the common good, right? Luther will say that in his when he expounds on the fourth commandment, you shall honor your father and mother. When he talks about that, certainly in the large catechism, he talks a lot about respecting all those in authority over us, insofar as they are enacting their authority for the common good, insofar as they are um, upholding their end, right? When they act not for the common good, when they act for self gain, when they act in ways antithetical to what we understand as God's intention for creation, it is actually our duty to stand up to them, right? And so Luther is very clear on this. The idea that something is a law in common terms, in earthly terms, the idea that something's a law or something that is someone in authority is not a blanket statement to do whatever you want, but rather that insofar as those things that are laws, those things that are authority, those things that are government, insofar as they uphold God's intention for creation, good. We should pray for them. We should support them, even if we don't agree with them, even if we don't like it. Um, but when they don't, those are the moments that we are called to stand up and change things. A side note: Luther's one thing Luther will say in the Large Catechism, which, for those that have studied the Small Catechism, the Large Catechism is just an expansion of the Small Catechism for pastors to use. Um, Not that everybody can't read it, but it's large, as the title says. But one thing Luther will say when talking about this is that he thinks all princes, which is the type of government that he knew, but all princes should have loaves of bread or sheaves of wheat in their coat of arms as a reminder of their responsibility before God to provide for those who hunger, to provide for those in need. And so that this should be part of the coat of arms of anybody in authority. And so that's really what Paul is talking about here. This idea that just because the law says one thing doesn't mean it's really for the common good. Doesn't really mean that it's beneficial or builds up. And so I want us just to take a brief moment to sort of piece out some of these words. We'll take a little break and talk about those things, and then I want to focus timely for today on some things from Martin Luther King Jr. and his letter from Birmingham jail that actually speak directly to this. So, lawful. What does it mean to be lawful? Well, in some translations of First Corinthians, it actually translated as uh, all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. So generally, lawful means that it's allowed. We can do it. There is no prescription against it. Um, I think certainly in what Paul is talking about, his idea of lawful is this idea that there's nothing to say we can't. Not quite the same as saying there's something that says we have to, but I would put all those in the same category, right? We can, it's allowed, it should be done, it's required. And so what Paul is talking about here is that there are plenty of things that are that, but beneficial. In the parallelism of Paul's 1 Corinthians, the two sentences he has, all things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. And so I would argue, at least by Paul, the idea of beneficial is this idea of building up. Beneficial is the common good, for the good, for the better, for the benefit. I mean, it's hard, I know that's a circular definition. Um, but, and so this idea of beneficial is that just because it's allowed or just because it's not disallowed, doesn't always mean that it's for the good. And I think we need to make sure that there's a distinction there. There are lots of things that aren't technically on the books, um, but should we be doing them? Well, no, we just didn't think we had to put it in writing. Um, it's and so I think it's important for us always to be able to piece out these things, right? I would argue in some ways Paul's talking a little bit here about spirit versus letter of the law, which is slightly different, and we will talk about that later. But the idea of spirit versus letter of the law, right, is that the law says X. Included in X is the intention of X. And so it may or may not be stated directly, but in the spirit of, in the intention of, in the idea behind a law or not a law, there's sort of this other expectation as well. So I think the more that we can realize that none of this, when it comes to sort of government and authority and the sort of society in which we live, the sort of civic organization of our society, um, is not monolithic, right? And should not be taken without critique. And certainly, one thing the church has been throughout history has been a critic of sort of this civic society in which we find ourselves. You know, I was listening to a podcast today out of two Episcopal priests that talk about some of the prayers of the church, and they pointed out, and I think it's a good point, right? If we think about the very first creed in the church, the first creed in the church is Jesus is Lord. The implication of Jesus is Lord is that Caesar is not, right? Jesus is Lord means that society is not. Jesus is Lord and I am not. And so if we think about that as sort of the first confession of the church, as it was, from the very beginning, the church has been this critic of sort of civic society. And so I think that's where we need to realize that we can piece out these different aspects of our civil organizations. Good. I mean, this is a hard one because good, like happy, like, there are just words that are hard for us to define. It's more amorphous than lawful or beneficial, but I would argue it's along the same lines of beneficial in that it leads to the betterment of self or others, not necessarily easy or comfortable, or maintaining the status quo, but sort of the betterment of. And I think that's something when we talk about good for us to realize is that it's not to say, oh, everything's okay now, so we don't need to change anything, right? Everything's fine, and I don't want to have to go through the extra work to do it. So it's good enough. It's okay, right? That's not what I think we're called to think about with good. I think we're called to think about sort of this betterment, always moving forward, always becoming more and more closely aligned with a sort of God's intention for creation. So so I put forth good as sort of this amorphous idea, but one that's this idea of betterment. And then finally, right. And I think this is one for us to think about, um, perhaps most, because doing what is right leads to a lot of these other things, or is part of the conversation of critiquing these other things. So this is perhaps the most subjective, because right, what is right, not politically right, but what is right is in the correct thing to do, is often, if not always, defined by the winning side of an argument, right? The winners of a war decide what was the right side. The winner, the most powerful in history decide what was the right side of history. And I think we hear a lot now, at least in the things I've been seeing in the circles I've been running in lately, about being on the right side of history, right? That we are called to be on the right side of history when faced with things like deep and abiding and deadly racism in our country, right? When we get to a point where we are so steeped in ideology that we cannot separate whether or not we should take arms into federal buildings, right? And so being on the right side of history is tough to do before you get there. And that's what makes right hard um, to truly define. But I would argue for us, it's moving in the direction towards which God calls us, moving closer to God's intention, doing that to which we are called by the gospel, alive in us, animating us to action in the world. And again, it's hard always to know what that is. And I think that there is at least some daring on our part uh, to do what is right, realizing that we may or may not in the end be doing right. But so long, I think, as we are seeking to live in the direction to which God calls us to the best of our abilities, I think our intentions there are good. So it's sort of an intro to think about how our civil society runs, how our legal system runs, how our government runs. Are there questions, comments on lawful, beneficial, good, and right?
How does morality fit in there? I mean, is that also um, subjective?
Well, and that's an interesting thing. Um, when I mean, obviously, for the sake of this conversation, I'm talking from a Christian Lutheran perspective because that's what we're talking about, engaging in the world. And I think that's one of those places where, um, for people of faith, morality is absolutely influenced, at least, by our faith. Do you need to be a person of faith to be moral? No.
No.
One of my favorite things that Bishop Eaton has said is that there are perfectly good moral um, atheists in the world that work the moral good. What makes us people of faith is the faith we hold, the worship we share, the ways that we are enlivened by the Spirit in the world. And so I think that we need to be sure that like faith, religion, morality also remain their own separate things. I think again, morality is somewhat amorphous, and I think it's definitely subjective in that what you see as the moral correct thing to do. Um, I think there's lots of arguments people could make from truly held beliefs. Um, and yet there is sort of this objective idea of what is moral and ethical for the good, right? And so I think in some ways we can think about what is the moral thing to do as the right thing to do, the good
Right.
thing to do, sort of for the betterment. um but that's one of those wonky places where we could sit and talk for weeks about the sort of interplay for people of faith like us, um, the interplay between faith and religion and morality, um, which makes it a little bit more interesting to play with. But I would argue sort of morality is trying to seek this good, right, beneficial thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, then I want to move into Martin Luther King. So it just so happens that yesterday, actually Saturday, and again a replay yesterday, the Metropolitan Washington D.C. Synod of the ELCA put together a beautiful video. It's on our Facebook page, and I can send the link if you're interested. Put together a beautiful video of African descent leaders from across the ELCA, rostered ministers from across the ELCA, reading the entirety of Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. It just so happens that it came, I saw it, I watched it, and went, this is exactly what we're talking about here. And so, at least portions of it. So I want to do a little bit with this. I thought it was particularly appropriate given today's honoring of Dr. King. So first, I need to give a little background if you don't already know it. If you already know it, bear with me. In 1963, in Birmingham, Alabama, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and charged with uh, parading without a permit. So, in one of his acts of nonviolent civil disobedience in Birmingham, Alabama, he was arrested and jailed in Birmingham, Alabama, and the charge was parading without a permit. In the newspaper, and he spent 12 days in jail. I mean, he spent a significant number of days in jail, in solitary confinement. But a sympathizer delivered the Birmingham, Alabama newspaper to him one day, where he read an open letter from 8 clergymen. They were all men, it was the 60s. 8 white clergymen from Birmingham, Alabama, who who wrote this open letter, which has since been called a call for unity. In it, they in it they wrote, at least in part, so it's a lengthy, typed like this in the 21st century, it's about 2 pages, so it was lengthy. But in part they wrote, however, we are now confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens, directed and led in part by outsiders. We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized, but we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. We agree rather with certain local Negro leadership which has called for honest and open negotiation of racial issues in our area. And we believe this kind of facing of issues can best be accomplished by citizens of our own metropolitan area, white and Negro, meeting within their knowledge and experience of the local situation. All of us need to face that responsibility and find proper channels for its accomplishment. Now, as I said, it was about 2 pages long, and it was signed by, I have it here, just a second. Um, it was signed by, where'd it go? Oh, here it is. It was signed by 8 clergymen, uh, 2 Catholic bishops, C.C.J. Carpenter and Joseph A. Durick, 1 rabbi, Rabbi Hilton J. Grafman, 2 bishops of the Methodist Church, Bishop Paul Hardin and Bishop Holland D. Harmon, 1 bishop coadjutor of the Episcopal Diocese, George Murray, 1 moderator of the Presbyterian Church, Edward Ramsage, and 1 pastor of the First Baptist Church of Germantown, Earl Stalling. These 8 white clergy folk basically wrote, as I said, a 2-page letter in the Birmingham newspaper that basically was saying, we get it, we hear ya, yeah, maybe we still have segregation, but we really don't want to be challenged like this. So maybe if you just do the way that's comfortable for us, maybe something will happen. Is basically what they say for 2 pages. In return, Dr. King writes a very lengthy open letter back, published, that he writes in the margin of the newspaper he was handed. He writes about a lot of things, but the part that we're going to listen to here, read by a few pastors and our own Bishop Davenport, is really piecing out the idea of lawful and beneficial, or as he puts it, just and unjust laws. But the idea that laws or our system of law is not above critique. And that he really puts out what I think is a great way for us to think about, as we come to critique the sort of civic society in which we find ourselves. So we're going to listen to that for a little bit. We're just going to listen to the middle of it. It's over an hour long if you listen to the whole thing. Well worth your time to listen to, so please do. But I'm going to play just sort of the portion that talks about just and unjust laws. This is not right. It was supposed to start here. Just a second. It didn't start in the right place. And it has no sound. Well, this is fun. All right, everybody, give me 1 second. I got to figure this out. But it is much better to hear from them than from me. So let's try this again. No. Okay. All right, everybody, give me 1 second. I have to pull this up separately. I also have to deal with a bunch of people. Windows open. There we go. Here we go. So, does anybody hear this? No. Why is there no
No.
sound? Oh, that's why. That's why, because the sound is
Cage.
okay. All right, so let's try it this way again, because now I actually know what's wrong with the sound. All right, so here
We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed towards gaining political independence, but we still creep at a horse and buggy pace towards gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your Black brothers and sisters, when you have seen the vast majorities of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-county drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you, when you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes nigger, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. At first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us consciously to break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all.
Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, constitutes an I-it relationship or an I-thou relationship, and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Is not segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? Thus it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, for it is morally right. And I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong. Let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow and that it itself willingly will follow. This is sameness made legal. Let me give another example. A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising the law. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up that state's segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout all Alabama, all sorts of devious methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. And there are some counties in which, even though Negroes constitute a majority of the population, not a single Negro is registered. Can any law enacted under such circumstances be considered democratically structured?
Sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I have been arrested on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there is nothing wrong in having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but such an ordinance becomes unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. I hope you are able to see the distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rabid segregationists. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. Of course, there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom, it is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws.
I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to await for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand the law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace in which the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight, to a substantive and positive peace in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open, where it can be seen and dealt with. Like a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all of its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed, with all the tension its exposure creates, to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion, before it can be cured.
In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act by the misguided populace in which they made him drink hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? We must come to see that, as the federal courts have consistently affirmed, it is wrong to urge an individual to cease his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest may precipitate violence. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. I had also hoped that the white moderate would reject the myth concerning time in relation to the struggle for freedom. I have just received a letter from a white brother in Texas. He writes, all Christians know that colored people will receive equal rights eventually. But it is possible that you are in too great a religious hurry. It has taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth. Such an attitude stems from a tragic misconception of time, from the strangely irrational note that there is something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity.
You speak.
Can't hear you.
Yes. So the it goes on. It's fabulous. I invite you to listen to it, the fullness of it. But it's important, I think, particularly with some of the conversations happening in our society today, in the United States today, in our legislatures today, for us to have heard some of these words about engaging with the idea of just and unjust laws, when and how do we engage, and certainly I think from the Reverend Dr. King, some fabulous evidence from scripture and history. I think, though, it is very important for us to remember as we talk about Dr. King, as we use him now, to sort of hear this charge from him that I think really should stand um, uh, to really be a mirror for many of us, which is this quote, which I think is really an important one, which is, I must make, and I should mention a quote we don't often hear from Dr. King because it's really not convenient for certainly us white folk to hear. But he writes, I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. Remember, he's speaking to the white clergymen of Birmingham. First, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time and who constantly advises to wait until a more convenient season. I think it's important for us to hear that because what this talks about is what we see in the work that happens in South Africa around reconciliation and justice there, post-apartheid, that we're skipping over even now in the 21st century. So if we think this letter is what, 57 years old now, something like that, and we're still in this place of, well, there may be a lot of things that cause the current situations of racism or current situations, but in an effort for unity, let's forget about all of it. And that's really not beneficial. It's lawful, it's not beneficial. It's not good. It's not right to sort of skip over certain things that are sort of these fundamental injustices for the sake of order and unity. If you remember, the letter that the clergyman wrote was titled A Call for Unity. Um, and basically, what Dr. King is saying is unity insofar as it really means unity, and it is for the common good and the good of all, but not when it's going to be sort of this painted over, uh, sweep everything under the rug kind of unity, right? If we just don't talk about it, it'll go away or it'll fix itself, is not really the model of justice that Dr. King has for us, but rather this idea that we talk about it and we work through it together, right? We are committed to one another to work through it. And I think that is something that is, in many ways, a charge to us still today, to continue to have these conversations, to continue to be engaged and to speak up and to speak out, and to not allow these things to be swept under the rug or quite literally whitewashed, for the sake of what? Peace? Peace at the expense of what? Um, and so when we talk about lawful, beneficial, good, and right, this is really what we get to is it good for there to be this sort of tenuous piece where we just don't talk about it? Maybe. Is it right? No. Is it beneficial? No. Is it lawful? Sure. Right. I mean, and so I think it's just something for us to think about as we do this, as we figure out ways to engage, and as we realize that we can piece out this is good and this isn't, right? We don't need to throw out the whole system. We need to go through the system together and say, but these things aren't working anymore and they need to be fixed and we need to work on them. And we can do that as people of faith, to come to the table and say, yes, our conviction is that in the common humanity, right, in the very fact that humanity is beloved of God, we need to seek the good of all people, whatever that looks like. It's tough work, right? It's not fun work for anybody, I think. But it's what we're called to do. And so I wanted us to sort of have that moment of hearing these quotes from Dr. King, which I think we often don't hear um, uh, this time of year, right? We often hear sort of much more the idea of the long arc of history. The arc of history is long but bends toward justice, right? I choose love because hate is too great a burden to bear, which are very good sentiments of Dr. King, but I think we don't always hear the real drive um, of what and how we are called to do. And certainly as a person of faith, for Dr. King to speak up and do so. I want to give us a chance here at the end to have questions, comments, conversation, because that's what I have for us to talk about this week. So there are no more slides, just a chance for conversation. or a chance for all of us to be done a little early. Well, seeing no questions or comments on this, I do invite you to continue to have these conversations, to continue to think about these ways we are called to engage our faith in public life. Certainly one of those ways, both prayer and participation. This Wednesday, there are several online events to take tours of the national monuments and participate in some of the celebrations of the inauguration, or simply to watch it on TV. The Bishop of Southeastern Pennsylvania has called us to prayer this week for our common life in this country. And certainly I think that's certainly one of the easier ways for us to engage in our common life this week. Yes, Penny.
I was just going to say thank you for
Oh, yes.
tonight. I don't particularly have a
Oh,
question.
no, that's fair. I just always like to be mindful of who unmutes themselves.
Right.
But so I invite you to sort of take these with you. And as I said, Metro DC Synod on YouTube has the full hour-long letter being read, which is really just beautiful. There is, for those that would otherwise be there, there is no Bible study this week. So there's council tomorrow that counts for 2 of you. And there's no Bible study this week because at 12 noon on the 20th of January, I will be otherwise occupied. And then in the evening, I actually have a Zoom call with the Office of Faith Engagement for the City of Philadelphia, specifically talking about houses of worship and the vaccine. And so I need to be on that call. And since I don't know how long that will take, there won't be an evening session either. So council tomorrow for some of you, and then Sunday will be the next time that we have Zoom. Yes, John.
And at 12 noon Wednesday is when the administrations actually change, and we hear the, they take the oath, and we hear the inaugural address and everything.
Oh yes, that was my joke. That's what I will be doing at 12 noon, and so we won't have Bible study.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Fair enough.
Right.
But yes, exactly. So thank you all for this. It was a great opportunity to share a little bit, and I will see some